people another minute or two to join.
Okay, shall we go for it, Jeff?
So, okay, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining. This is part one in our webinar series of 3, as part of the Enhancing Agroecosystems, as well as the extension work streams of A Lighter Touch. We're very pleased to present this webinar series that's open to all of our participants. The webinars will be led by Dr. Charles Merfield, better known as Merf. Merf's head of the BHU at the Future Farming Centre at Lincoln. The aim of the webinar series is to help build the background understanding of agroecology, and particularly how it pertains to crop protection and its application and practice. Behind the webinar series is the A Lighter Touch Enhancing Agroecosystems project in Gisborne, using a citrus orchard as the model growing system. And the final webinar in July will show the application of this background knowledge to this case study project. I'm sure many of you know Merf already, so that you know that these presentations will be packed with information. If you have any questions, please ask these during the session via the chat function, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. The webinar is being recorded and we'll post it on our website following the presentation this morning. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Merf. Thanks, Merf.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Can everybody see that? Okay. Let me also get this panel out of the way. Cool, right, we go. Okay, an explainer to agroecology. This was really interesting when I started putting this together, because I discovered it's actually really difficult to explain what agroecology is, because it's a really big thing. It's like a multifaceted jewel. So I'm going to take a number of angles to look at it through these different facets: a historical, what its objectives are, some definitions, which I think are actually not terribly helpful. Then I want to have a bit of a look at about what ecology is. The FAO's in the agroecological space boots and all, so we're going to look at their 10 elements. And then we're going to spend quite a bit of time at the end actually looking at some practical on-the-ground examples, which are probably going to be a bit more helpful, I think, than something like the definitions, but I'm going to cover it all off. Just to be very clear, the name is obviously a combination of the words agriculture and ecology, but I also want to make the point that agroecology is increasingly being used as the umbrella term for all the sustainable agricultures. So organics is a kind of agroecology, regenerative ag is a kind of agroecology. So they're all kind of coming under this broad term, but agroecology is also a thing in and of itself. Okay, the historical facet we'll look at first, because that kind of helps put things on a bit of a basis. So it's a century-old agroecology. It started as this science looking and studying farming through an ecological lens. Then in the 1960s, after about 40 years of kind of looking at farming through ecology, somebody said, how about actually doing some farming through ecology? So this is version 2, essentially doing farming with an ecological mindset. And then in the 1980s, mostly in South America, which is the kind of stronghold of agroecology, it's far bigger in South America than organics is, for example. They said, hang on, farming's only half of the food system. What about the consumption and the distribution, even the post-consumption side of the food system? And so it expanded to encompass the whole food system. And as part of that, you can't get in the consumption side without starting to get into sociology and becoming a social movement, and it's even a political movement now. And this is version 3, but there's quite a lot of space between version 2 and version 3, and in places like North America and Europe, version 3 really kind of doesn't exist. It's very much version 2 agroecology is viewed as being within the farm gate. It tends to be South America, where it's moved outside the farm gate. Okay, next facet, what's it trying to do? This is really quite simple. It's trying to transform the entire food system into something that is sustainable and permanent. So this isn't small stuff. It's basically looking to revolutionize agriculture away from the industrial, the intensive agricultural model. And so it's using ecological and like-minded sciences. Indeed, it's a capstone science. It includes stuff like physics and ecology, and physics, engineering as well. So it's a really broad discipline. Right, the definitions. This I found really interesting because I've been working in the regenerative space quite a lot. And one of the things that happened when regenerative agriculture first started getting some traction and visibility was there was a whole load of people thumping the table and going, okay, what's the definition of regenerative agriculture? And I was going, well, it's really hard to define. It's such a big thing. And that's exactly what I found with the definitions of agroecology. It's really hard to define something this big, complex, and multifaceted. For starters, it depends who's doing the definition and what their perspective, what facets they're looking at. Are we talking about versions 1, 2, or 3 of agroecology? So the first definitions from the USDA. We've got quite a bit of time and money to spend on this kind of thing. And I find really fascinating their opening gambit is agroecology can be defined broadly or narrowly. That's kind of not very helpful, isn't it? So the first bit of the definition here is really version 3. Environmentally and socially sensitive agriculture, not only on production, but the sustainability of the entire production system, so it goes beyond the limits of the agricultural field. And then the second bit, the kind of last 4 lines, at its most narrow, it refers to the study of ecological phenomenon within agriculture, which is version 1. So I'm kind of looking at this and going, well, hang on, version 2 isn't even in here. Next, a couple of other definitions, and then we'll leave these alone. So the first one's study of interactions between plants, organisms in the environment. And so that's kind of just stating that it's a form of ecology. And then the second bit there is covers integrated studies. So it covers, a wide range of other sciences, including stuff like economics. It's kind of, yeah, does that really kind of explain what it is? I don't think so. The last one there, to me, the key point is this is, it draws on traditional knowledge and farmers' knowledge. And certainly in South America, there are a very large number of traditional farmers, native farmers who are still doing the kinds of farming systems their great forebears were doing. And so agroecology in South America is very, very conscious of needing to draw on these traditional knowledge that farmers hold and developed over many, many centuries, even millennia. Okay, next facet. Let's kind of take it apart. It's 2 things. There's agriculture and ecology. I'm assuming everybody knows what agriculture is all about because you're on this webinar. What's ecology actually precisely? So it's the science of how organisms, all of them, including us, interact with all the other organisms in their environment and the non-living environment. So stuff like the weather, for example, that's not clearly alive. So it's inherently an interdisciplinary science. Everything is virtually there because agriculture itself is huge. There's so many scientific disciplines feed into agriculture by itself. So it is a complete capstone science. There is no science above agroecology. It is encompassing all of them. So it is very definitely into a multidisciplinary. Ecology is a really big thing as well. These are a bunch of the kind of major divisions within ecology. Life processes and interactions, movement of matter and energy through living systems, that's clearly physics. Succession of ecosystems, there's all the cooperation and competition stuff going on. Abundance, biomass distribution of organisms, and then patterns in biodiversity. Each of these are a university department. There could even be a university division dedicated to each and every one of these, because each of these is a really massive area of study and science. So channeling Douglas Adams, agriculture is big, ecology is big, agroecology is just really, really insanely big. We've got one of the leading and one of the most recent up-to-date textbooks here, Agroecology, 3rd edition by Gleisman. He's one of the leading proponents of agroecology. There's a good few dozen academics that have been working in the agroecology space, for many, many decades, essentially all of their lives. So if you actually want to go and start reading up about some of this stuff, this is one of the better and most recent books to get, so you can really start getting your head around what's in there. Right, next facet of this big complicated jewel, the FAO. The FAO is really interesting in this space. The FAO was the original cheerleader for intensive agriculture. So going back to the 1950s and 1960s, the FAO is championing intensive production yield maximization. And then it started becoming really disorganized through the 80s and into the 90s. And it had a kind of big change of perspective, and it moved from the intensification, moved much more into the sustainable space. And as part of that, FAO has been strongly championing agroecology for several decades now. And it's now got, it recently revised these, it had 12 of these elements, and it's now put them down to 10 after a bit of a rethink and a rejig. So we'll go through these just to give you an idea of kind of different perspectives that the FAO have in this space. And if you want to find this stuff, just Google FAO and agroecology, and you'll end up on their homepage of agroecology very quickly indeed. So first of the elements is diversity. And indeed, it's hard to overemphasize the importance of diversity, particularly biodiversity in the agroecology space. But it's not just biodiversity, every kind of diversity, ways of thinking, different economic systems and ways of approaching economics. And some of the agronomic stuff, intercropping, rotations, nutrition of animals and stock, etc. Co-creation and sharing of knowledge. This is very much a version 3 of agroecology coming in here, and very much that South American needing to involve the farmers on the ground. And indeed, if you look at all the extension science that's done on how to do effective extension, if you don't have farmers and growers involved from the very get-go, if you do science and expect them to implement it without them being involved, it's not going to happen unless it's really, really profitable or beneficial for them. Synergies, and again, at all the different levels, at the social levels, political levels, and the agronomic levels as well. And here, this is kind of classic 2 + 2 = 5 stuff. We're trying to be farming smarter rather than kind of just by farming by brute force. And stuff like intermixing legumes and grasses together for biological end fixation benefits for the grasses. Efficiency. You can look at intensive agriculture and go, okay, it's kind of just thrown the book at the problem. It's kind of just used the large inputs of pesticides and fertilizers to maximize yield. But that's not efficient, because you're getting into those marginal return spaces as you're trying to get towards maximum yield, and they're typically not profitable, and he's put a lot of energy for not a lot of gain. So again, this is the kind of 2 + 2 + 2 = 5 efficiency, trying to do things smarter, put less inputs in, but still keep your productivity and profitability up there. So making better use of the sunshine we've got. Certainly some of these things, fertilizers, for example, are going to become a scarcer and scarcer and more expensive resource. So we want to get the most out of them when we do use them. Recycling. There's no waste in nature. Everything is cycled. If you think about it, whether it's in a matter of hours of carbon dioxide being breathed out by animals and taken up by plants, to millions, tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of years in geological processes. Basically, all the matter, all the nutrients, all the elements, chemical elements on the planet are in constant cycling. It's only humans that dig stuff out of the ground in a short order, use them, and then put them in a different hole in the ground. That stuff doesn't work over timescales of more than a few centuries. So this recycling and making more efficient use of stuff, again, is a really important point. Resilience. if you look at most of the systems we as humans have developed, economic, political, social systems, many of them are really brittle. The just-in-time system of inventory movement is a classic example. You know, we have a bit of a panic and all the supermarkets run out of loo roll because they're brittle. This is a well-known phenomenon in the shopping systems, in the produce delivery systems. If the supermarkets had much bigger stocks, people wouldn't panic buy in the first place because they know there's plenty of food in the supermarket because it's got a big resource behind it, a big stock behind it to keep things on the shelves, even if people start increasing their buying patterns. So agroecology is doing the opposite of that. It's saying, okay, we need to build resilient farming systems, and diversification is a really important part of that. And this is more important generally, or ever more important, because we are getting more and more shocks to the system, you know, droughts, floods, you know, the produce delivery systems. We need to build farm systems that are much more resilient, that will resist external shocks and even internal shocks, and they can rebound and recover faster from shocks rather than having systems that are brittle and break when they are hit by external challenges. Human and social values, this is absolutely level 3 agroecology, and very much it's focused on that kind of developing world stuff, you know, equity, social well-being, all these kinds of things. I mean, it does also apply, you know, to developed world as well, you know, employment rights, those kinds of things are in here as well. And you've got to remember the FAO is part of the United Nations, the UN, and they have the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and certainly all the different parts of the UN are making sure they are all correctly aligned up with things like the SDGs. Food and cultural traditions. If you kind of go back 50 or so years and you think about different countries, the culture of a country and its traditional food are completely meshed together. You know, if I say sauerkraut, you think of Germany. You know, paella, you think of Spain. You know, in New Zealand, especially with the pakiha, you know, much more recent culture, we don't have that food culture. So again, the culture and food traditions are interlinked. And so in agroecology, saying actually regaining these things like the slow food movement, the importance of that. So you can see agroecology, this is a long way from the farm gate. You're talking about food and culture traditions. Responsible governance. Hang on, governance. So the FAO also has this thing called SAFA, the Sustainable Agricultural Assessment Framework, and governance, which is basically the mother of all agricultural assessment frameworks, like organic certification as an assessment framework, or global and NZ GAP as a framework, assessment framework. Governance is a quarter of that in SAFA. So although you kind of think, well, this is a really long way from the farming, you know, the importance of governance in this space is really quite critical. Circular and solidarity economy, again, there's part of that kind of recycling, there is no waste in nature, but this is also kind of this connecting producers and consumers, you know, local food systems. And in New Zealand and you know, other parts of the world, we've seen a resurgence of things like farmers markets. In places like continental Europe, you know, some of these very much food cultures that, you know, have kept going. The farmers markets never actually disappeared, you know, certainly they disappeared in the UK, you know, in the early 80s, and they only had a revival by the time we got into the 2000s. Okay, that's a load of kind of relatively complicated stuff. Let's have a look at practical examples. So we are talking specifically level 2 agroecology. What does this mean on the ground? Rotations. This is classic agroecology, especially when you've got cropping and livestock mixed together. Everybody's basically been doing agroecology, but without realizing it. Intercropping. New Zealand farming is built on the intercropping of ryegrass and white clover. It's a very simple intercrop because it's only 2 of them. It's a very effective intercrop. Cover crops. So I'll come to these, a few of these in the next slides. Mixing livestock species. Cattle and sheep do not share their same internal parasites in New Zealand, so you can use one to mop up and kill the parasites of another, particularly for young stock. Biocontrol and integrated pest management. Biocontrol is a really massive discipline. Again, this is a whole university department or division, and it's part of integrated pest management. So let's go and have a look at a few of these. So this whole diversity thing and biodiversity. Increasing the diversity, particularly of plants on our farms, then drives the diversity of everything else. and that social diversity. One of the things in regenerative agriculture, it's very much the mindset. It's how you're thinking about doing farming. Intensive agriculture, the stuff we've been doing for the last 70 years, aims to do exactly the opposite. It's aiming to simplify stuff with this core aim of increasing yields and by lots of external inputs. But the problem is we are increasingly realizing no attention is being paid to the externalities of this system, and those chickens are certainly coming home to roost now. This is a really massively important paper, and Liebman here, who wrote the agroecology book, is one of the authors here. I'm just going to have to unpack this to make sure everybody's on the same page. So, a meta-study. This is where some very statistically nerdy scientists goes and gathers a whole load of research papers, i.e. where somebody went and did an experiment and published that. They gather all those research papers on a particular topic, which in this case here is agricultural diversification. They then throw out the rubbish ones, which I always find to be a bit of a worry that they got published. And then they get all the data from all those papers, combine it all together and reanalyze it. Now, we're doing this because basically one scientific paper doesn't make a summer. Due to the fact we've got this 95% confidence interval, statistically 5% of papers have the wrong result, whether it's positive or negative wrong result. So what we do is we never look at a single paper and say, okay, that proves something. What we do is we look at lots and lots of different papers on the same topic and go, what do they say en masse? A meta-study, therefore, does that with some statistical rigor. A second order meta-study, as it's technically known, or as I rather prefer, a meta-meta-study, is where some unbelievably nerdy statistician takes a whole load of first order meta-studies, combines them and reanalyze this data. So this is statistical dark arts. It just gives me the heebie-jeebies. These guys can even do this stuff. So allegedly, this is the first meta-meta study that's ever been done in agriculture. It's apparently really common in medical science because there's just so much medical science done and published. So this meta-meta study, it's looking at the impact of agricultural diversification. And as the headline says, it promotes multiple ecosystem services without compromising yield. Without compromising yields, I think is actually not technically correct. Oops, sorry, going the wrong way here. So in terms of the number of studies, over 5,000 original studies comparing nearly 42,000 comparisons of diversified and simplified practices. There is a jaw-dropping amount of data that underpins this. And the headline numbers are, when some scientist somewhere goes, well, I wonder what happens if we do this kind of diversification on this farm, 60% of the time, they get their lotto ticket cashed in. 67, 3/4 of the time, they get positive effects. 23% of the time, they don't find anything. 10% of the time, there are negative effects. Diversifying stuff is not a guarantee everything is going to be rosy. But this is just scientists taking guess about stuff. So one of my lines is, the role of the agricultural scientist is to make all the dumb mistakes so you guys don't have to. You basically go, well, we'll skip the 23 and 10% and we'll go for that 3/4, 67% figure. And here's breaking down those headline numbers. This crop yield, 50% of the time, when some scientist goes, I wonder if this diversification is going to benefit crop yield, 50% of the time they get a win. Only 16% of the time it's a negative, and then whatever the rest of that number is, it had no effect. So 50% of the time, crop yield went up by diversification. This is completely contrary to the view of intensive agriculture that says no, yield should go down if you diversify stuff. Soil fertility, nutrient cycle, massive wins, same for carbon sequestration. The one fly in the ointment here is climate regulation. Clearly, the number of positives there is small, quite a lot smaller than the negatives and the neutrals. So that needs looking at. But stuff like biodiversity, completely unsurprising, biodiversity goes up when you diversify your farm system. Cover cropping. Cover cropping isn't one thing. It's actually about 8 different sub-disciplines within it. And we, names for these things. If you're trying to fix nitrogen, we've got green manures, we've got catch crops to prevent nitrogen leaching, kind of the opposite of doing it. Smother crops for lots of biomass, living mulch. Living mulches are basically the end game in perennial cropping for having underneath the tree. We need them there to protect soil, suppress weeds, and fix nitrogen. Then relay cropping. It's kind of like, why do we grow one crop, stop, kill everything, and then plant another one? Well, these kinds of techniques, you plant your following crop into the existing crop, so you just harvest the first crop and the second crop's already there. Save a whole lot of time and aggro and money and everything else. Trap crops. These are really interesting. Okay, this is a push-pull system. This is the most famous push-pull system. So this is a terminology in the agroecology space for a specific system that's pushing a pest out of the crop and pulling it out of the crop at the same time. This is the most famous. So in Africa, they're growing maize and sorghum, and it's getting completely hammered by this little stem borer and a parasitic weed called strigia, and yields the stuff because they don't have nitrogen fertilizers either. So these crops are performing really, really poorly. So they developed this system. The desmonium produces chemicals that repel the leaf borer, the stem borer rather. So it's pushing it out of the crop. Then they have this bracharia grass outside that's really attractive to the adult stem borers. So they're pushed out of the crop and then pulled by this bracharia grass. The thing is with this grass is the adults will lay their eggs on it, but it's lethal for the larvae. So the eggs hatch, the larvae start eating the bracharia and it kills them. Genius. But wait, there's more. The desmonium also produces chemicals out of its roots, allelia chemicals, that deplete the strigia, the parasitic weeds, deplete the seed bank. And it's also nitrogen fixing, so it's making a whole load of nitrogen. Now, the common view is when you've got something, a nitrogen fixing crop like this in with a perennial, with a living mulch effectively, in with something like sorghum or maize, the nitrogen that's fixed by the desmonium, the legume, isn't released until it's killed. This is completely wrong. There's mycorrhizal associations between the legumes and the sorghum and maize that are transferring nitrogen directly between them. Indeed, researchers have put radioactive nitrogen gas on the legumes, and within hours, they've detected that radioactive nitrogen in the maize or the sorghum or the crop. Literally hours transfer time. Because what's going on is the mycorrhizae fungi are literally operating a trading floor for nutrients. They're really good at getting phosphorus out of soil. Legumes need phosphorus due to the nitrogen fixation mechanism. So they go to the legumes, okay, mate, I've got some nice phosphorus here. How much nitrogen are you going to give me for it? And the legume goes, right, okay, we'll give you this much nitrogen for your phosphorus. Then it fluffs off over to the corn or the sorghum and goes, hey, mate, I've got this nitrogen. How much carbon are you going to give me for this nitrogen? Because the key thing the mycorrhizal fungi needs is carbon. And the thing that corn and sorghum are really good at is capturing lots of carbon from the atmosphere. So people have actually studied this. The fungi are actually operating a trading floor. They will find the highest bidder for their phosphorus, and then they will find the best buyer for the nitrogen they swapped it for. And then they won't give it to all the other plants they're connected. Quite phenomenal. So this is it's a really simple system, but it has revolutionized sorghum and maize production in Africa. Conservation biocontrol. There's three forms of biocontrol. Importation, often called classical, where you bring something in from overseas to control a pest that came from overseas. We do huge amounts of this in New Zealand. Augmentation is where the biocontrol agent's already in the environment. You're augmenting it, you're putting more in. And conservation biocontrol, this is the really ecological approach. What we do is manipulate a whole bunch of stuff in the environment, typically plants, to enhance the outcomes we want. One of the classics in New Zealand is the late great Steve Ratten's greening Waipara, where they put buckwheat, this is actually a picture of Phacelia here, into vineyards to boost the parasitoids, which then controlled the leaf roller caterpillars that were causing problems in the grape. And Steve was always great for a snappy acronym, and this is his. So we put flowering plants into the environment to provide shelter, nectar, alternative food, prey, and pollen. SNAP. Intercropping. Starting really simple, multiple scales here. Just mixing different cultivars of the same crop, particularly in the arable space, can have a massive impact on disease levels. You start going into simple bicrops, peas and wheats. These can have really quite profound effects. Get significant increases in yield and a massive reduction in pest diseases and weeds. It's almost like they're acting as a fire break for each other. Getting up into more diversity, the famous three sisters intercrop of maize, bean and pumpkins has basically kept South America fed for centuries. 10 species mixtures, the regen guys really love their mixtures, and they'll be putting 10, 20, 30 species of plants into their pastures and cover crops. In Europe, they can put 60 species of plants into a pasture. I don't think we've actually got enough species here to be able to do that. And at scale, agroforestry. Agroforestry is the deliberate intercropping of woody vegetation. And this woody vegetation is very sparse, typically in rows that are 20, 30, 40 meters apart. And the trees are maybe 5 meters apart down the line. So it's not a lot of trees. They're very thin. But this is an immensely powerful system as well. The benefits of agroforestry are legion, and the negatives are really quite low. It's basically management complexity. And you can intercrop trees, excuse me. You can intercrop trees with livestock, with cropping, or mixed farming as well. All of them have massive benefits. Okay, let's wrap everything up. So you've all been doing agroecology already. And so it's kind of like, just keep going, just do more and more of it. It's nothing new, and it's certainly not scary. And certainly thanks to the likes of the EU, putting a huge amount of research into this space and organic farming and many of these alternative farming systems. There's a huge amount of practical experience out there, well-validated science, and there's stuff you can just go and start implementing already. And what's also going on is I think we're actually at the point we have a proper schism in agriculture. On one side, we have the intensive agriculture, yield maximization is everything. And on the other side, we have the agroecologies, plural, organics and regen and agroforestry and all this other stuff. And having been in this space for 30 years, I can assure you the agroecology department was pretty small, you know, back in the 80s and 90s. There's an awful lot of people in the agroecology department. The whole of the UN, the FAO, International Panel on Climate Change strongly recommends it. The EU is fully committed to an agroecological future for farming and growing in Europe. So I'm looking at this and kind of going, the agroecology department has grown really massively over the last 30, 40 years, and it is increasingly being clear that agroecology is the future of agriculture as a whole. Thank you very much. I will get rid of that and we can take some questions. Jeff, do you want to chair questions?
Yep, sure. I've just asked in the chat if anyone's got any questions to fire them through by the chat function.
Cool.
Nothing there just yet.
Right.
Merf, I was just reading this morning a report from, I think, some Swedish scientists saying under an organic regime, 30% more land would be required to produce the same yield. I guess
yeah, this is kind of what I call the myth of yield. The problem is the current farming system is putting so much stresses on the planetary systems that they risk failing. You know, if we carry on doing intensive agriculture, we will break the planetary systems that keep us alive. You know, so it's kind of not an option. Certainly in places like Africa, the studies show that changing to agroecological systems will massively boost yields as well. You know, the push-pull system is the classic example of that. And to me, you know, the yield question in New Zealand, in terms of New Zealand agriculture and horticulture, is something of a moot point, because we're not in the business of producing yields to try and feed people. We're in the business of selling essentially food stories to 40 million rich people overseas. You know, there's 7+ billion people in the world. We produce a lot of feed, but it's only for 40 million people. You know, and we're a high-cost country, so we can't afford, you know, to try and produce low-cost food to food people, you know, who are really desperately hungry. It's a bit of a brutal political point, but, you know, we're in the business of selling food to rich people. So as a New Zealand agricultural system, we need farming systems that our rich clients and customers overseas are willing to pay premiums for their food. And to me, you know, budget basement agriculture is not what those customers want. What they want is stuff like agroecology. Yeah. Let's see if that stirred a few people up.
Cool. A couple of questions coming through, Merf. From Deborah, how can the market for agricultural and horticultural produce from New Zealand be best supported and as soon as possible?
Okay. Supported in what way? Just trying to get my head around that. I mean, to me, it's taking, stuff like the Zespri story and wine that have really hit those high value markets. I've been told Zespri gets something like a 30% premium over equivalent kiwi fruit because of the backstory. So to me, it's just going through all the kind of usual channels, stuff like a lighter touch in terms of getting this message out to growers and spreading the word about these kinds of techniques. Let us know if that answered your question, because I wasn't quite sure the key point in that question. Yeah. Another one, Jeff.
There's another one here from Chris. Hi, particularly interested in legumes, not required to die to produce nitrogen. Definitely not common understanding.
Yeah.
Can you provide some papers to read, please?
Yep, I certainly can. I'll go and dig some out afterwards. I'll make a note to self. Legume papers. I'll put some links through. So yeah, look, and I mean, there's been a complete revolution in soil science around soil health and the formation of organic matter in the last 10 years. It's astonishing. You'd think we'd had this stuff sorted centuries ago. But the revolution has been around the importance of living plant roots. It is those and the exudates the roots push out into the soil to feed the microorganisms in the soil. Those are what are driving soil health. And they're literally all talking underground to each other. The plants will even change the type of exudates they push out through their roots to target specific microbes, bacteria and fungi and all the rest of it that can help them with their particular need at that time. So we kind of think there's just a whole lot of microorganisms underground doing stuff. No, man, they're all talking to each other underground, helping and competing and everything else all at the same time. Astonishing that we've had such a revolution in understanding.
Cool. Deborah's just expanded on that question, the earlier question. So how can the market for ag and hort produce from New Zealand be best supported? And it should be sustainably produced produce.
Yeah. I mean, to me, I'm not a marketing person, but, I look at, I've just forgotten the name of them, Professor of Economics, Caroline Saunders down here at Lincoln. She's been banging the drum for years about the importance of getting out of commodity food and moving into these higher value niches. And a lot of that is literally about selling the food story. The actual food itself almost becomes somewhat incidental. You consider somebody in Japan is paying, the equivalent of $6 or $8 for a kiwi fruit. It's a huge price we get over there, and they're buying it because of that story, that backstory on the thing. So to me, the critical thing here is we need to move more into this space, because what our customers who are paying, $6 to $8 for a kiwi fruit, they don't want to hear a story about how all their kiwi fruit are being sprayed with tons of ag chem and stuff. That's not going to fly. So we can move into the space and say, hey, we're using flowers for controlling our pests. The price of that kiwi fruit goes up even more. I hope that got your question. But yeah, I'm not a marketing person, so on that side, I'm not fully aware of how we get that message out there.
Cool. A question here from Trevor Richards. What's your view on Tagastace as part of the
yeah, tree lucerne. Yeah, look, I mean, I've heard people, tree lucerne, it's a tree, it's a legume, so it fixes nitrogen. I have heard people call it an honorary native, Kereroo like feeding on the leaves and the flowers as well. So it's an amazing nurse crop. So for me, a lot of the time in the doc department, we have this kind of natives good, exotics bad. I think that's really too much of a simplification. Clearly, there are bad exotics. Wilding pines and the Mackenzie are a complete disaster, but certainly prudent use of some exotics, I think, are really important.
Any tricks for germinating the seed of?
Oh no, I'm not. Sorry, not a tree person. I don't know. The young seedlings are frost sensitive, so you really want to be getting them going in the spring. Maybe put them through a Kereroo, because I'm not being facetious here, because a lot of seeds are really quite hard, and they do need to pass through livestock. Fat hen, 70% germination off the plant. If you put it through a cow, it's 100% germination. So, just a bit of time even.
Someone's just asked if the PowerPoint's available after this.
Yeah, we can make the PowerPoints available as well. I'll flip those over to you.
It'll be on our website.
Yeah, so they're in the Dropbox as well. So
alightofTouch.co.nz, you can find the link there. There's a question from Zan. Is the New Zealand export wine industry actually consistent with the concept of agroecology? What's your view there, Merf?
I think we're getting there. One of the things since I started getting involved in the wider industries is the understanding of agroecology and the different kinds of biocontrol hasn't been strong. But I think the industries are realizing the importance of this transition, and they are engaging ever increasingly strongly in this space. So I'm actually going to be talking at all 3 grape days this year and virtually all of the spray days. Around herbicide resistance. And that's the other thing pushing us in this space, herbicide resistance. There's been a big herbicide resistance management project, partly MB funded, and the amount of herbicide resistance that's been found so far on New Zealand farms is really, really high. They just surveyed the Marlborough vineyards. 50% of Marlborough vineyards had glyphosate resistant ryegrass on it. 50% of them have got herbicide-resistant ryegrass, just astonishing. So, we need to be pulled by our customers, but we are also being pushed, by the fact that many of the intensive agricultural technologies are now starting to fail on us.
Yeah. I wonder if that was coming from a food miles sort of perspective.
Yeah.
That question.
Possibly, yeah. Food miles is a really dodgy concept because the thing is it's only one component of the total energy in the system, and you really need to be looking at all of these things on a life cycle analysis, which is a problem because life cycle analysis is really complex, and you have to be careful to actually make sure you're interpreting and actually designing the life cycle analysis correctly to get a meaningful result out of it. So yeah, don't look at food miles alone.
Yep. Rob's just asked how the citrus trial's been going, so I might address that.
Yeah, go for it.
And yeah, fair to say we had a couple of hiccups with the weather in Gisborne, both spring and late summer. We had those massive rainfalls and a dry period in between. So establishment from the spring sowing of those cover crop trials wasn't fantastic. The site up the valley was a little bit better than the one down on the flats. And we've resown the one at Santigens as an autumn sown concept, and we've done half of the one up the valley at Tam's Orchard. So we'll have a comparison there, spring versus autumn sowing of those cover crop species. The data's, we are collecting data on a fortnightly basis, so the orchards have been monitored, and Ash, I think Ash is online actually, from Plant and Food has been collating that data. There's the trend is between treated and untreated, if you like, is fairly consistent at this stage. It is a long-term concept, this whole project, so wouldn't expect to see massive differences this early on, but we're continuing that monitoring right through the winter and next growing season as well, and hopefully we'll see the gap between treated and untreated start to widen a little bit, and some differences come out. So the WhatsApp's still running. It's been a little bit light with traffic, but keep an eye on that because there's a bit of information coming through that channel.
And the thing I'd add in this space as well, try this at home. These aren't pesticides where there's lots of regulations. There's nothing to stop you, trying some living mulch species under your trees, under your crops in the perennial space, putting a multi-species mixture in. The rule here is always do not bet the vineyard, the orchard or whatever on it. Try small areas to start with. But, the rule in ecology is everybody's mileage varies. What works up in the Hawke's Bay isn't going to work necessarily in Marlborough or Central Otago or anywhere else, around the country. You need to try this stuff at home. Start small, and as you find things that work, then start expanding it. So don't wait for the researchers to tell you the answer. You're going to have to, take some leads from the research, but go and try this at home.
Cool, thanks, Merf. And yes, one of the outputs from that project is to produce some tools on the how-to. So and that will go up on their website and be distributed through the product groups as well. So Sally Anderson's writing that, and she's well into the establishment part of that, producing that toolkit. So that won't be too far away. We'll be able to publish that and give you some real practical tips on what we experience, but the species involved and the practical on-farm part of it as well.
good.
Cool. I
Any
think
more
we're staying on
questions?
time.
Right, cool, very good.
So that the next webinar in this series is Tuesday, the 14th of June, again at 11 o'clock. And Merf's going to dive into the 3 types of biocontrol in more depth in that one. So look forward to seeing you all again then. Sorry, just one more question coming in. Any comments on comfrey and orchard situation?
Interesting. It's an old organic favourite. The whole Henry Doubleday, what is now Garden Organic, was founded on comfrey. We've got it here at the BHU. The wrong types can be quite invasive, actually. It can be a right pain to kind of get out. So it'll be interesting to go and actually do some research on that in an orchard situation where you'd be able to confine it a bit better. So I simply don't know, sorry. But yeah, don't bet the whole orchard on it. Put it in a small area to start with.
Any New Zealand native plants that would work as ground cover and tree crops?
Yeah, look, people. Steve Ratton actually did some work in this space. I think they tried bitty and a few others. So there are some, but they don't tend to be really competitive. One thing you need in a living mulch is it really needs to be a big thug of a plant that can outcompete the true weeds. And we found quite a few of the natives. They tended to get invaded by other plants and things like grasses, which are real weeds. So yeah, I've not got a lot of space. This is one of the reasons we need to start ramping more research up in this area to actually looking at individual species and see what their performance is like. And again, try and put a diversity of species, under the trees rather than just one thing.
Great. Well, thanks again, Merf.
Very good.
We're a little bit over time now, so we'll look forward to catching up with you next month.
Great. Thank you all for coming in and listening. All the best.
Thank you.